The GoToWebinar control panel.
So again, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Russell Holden. I'm with Render Plus Systems, and today our live webinar is focused on iRender Next and lighting for renderings, both natural and artificial lighting. The objective of today is to help you match your SketchUp modeling skills with some rendering skills so that you can create presentation quality renderings of your SketchUp models. Our webinar will take approximately 45 minutes. I want to invite you to ask questions as we go. I don't really expect that you have any experience with high-end renderers, and certainly I don't expect that you have any experience at all with iRender Next. In fact, you may have a trial version of iRender Next installed, and it could be that you're just exploring rendering software, but maybe haven't even downloaded a trial version of our software yet. That's perfectly fine. You've come to the right place, and I hope that today will help you gain a lot of confidence, not only with high-end renderers, but in particular with the features included in iRender Next. If you haven't visited the Render Plus Systems YouTube channel, I want to invite you to do that. Our YouTube channel has videos created by end users who are experts at iRender Next software, and they do a very nice job of explaining iRender Next features using models they've created and solving some lighting and reflection and other high-end rendering issues, and then turning right around and explaining to you exactly how they achieved very nice renderings with our software. So just consider bookmarking Render Plus Systems, the Render Plus Systems channel on YouTube. New videos are added with some frequency, and this is where you will also find recordings of previous webinars. This is also where I'll be publishing today's live webinar once we're finished. Another good bookmark, especially while you're trying our software and learning it, is renderplus.com. Renderplus.com is a very nice resource for exploring iRender Next features. There are tutorials, both video and written, as well as access to online documentation that explores iRender Next features in detail and explains exactly how these features work and gives you some very nice tips on how to use them. So bookmark renderplus.com and refer to this resource frequently. If you have a trial version of iRender Next installed, as soon as you start SketchUp, in order to enable our interface, click Extensions, and when you do, this drop-down will appear. You'll notice that there's iRender Next -load and then iRender Next below it. iRender Next is a list of the interface features. When you click iRender Next 6 load, that'll actually load our toolbar. Typically that toolbar is going to load just like other extensions adjacent to the SketchUp toolbar. I peeled it away because I want everyone to have an opportunity to focus on the iRender Next features that we're going to be discussing today. Now, hopefully everyone who has installed either a trial or a licensed copy of iRender Next has the software up and running and has seen this toolbar. So if you have not seen the toolbar and this is new, please type in, "This is the first time I've seen it," or something to that effect in the form of a question. That'll give me a good idea of a need to provide a little bit more orientation as we go through features. This is a SketchUp model from the 3D warehouse that I uploaded. It's a beach cottage. Many of you may be pretty familiar with this model. The nice thing about iRender Next is that when we open a model from the warehouse, these models are ready to render. You can see that there are textures applied to surfaces. The windows are in fact a glass material. All of the textures are properly oriented. They're nicely scaled. As soon as you open up a model, the first thing that you might want to do is just click the render button, and that's right here, this little green sphere. So click it, and when you do, this dialog will appear. This is a very important dialog, not only for new users, but expert users as well. The top of this menu shows 5 lighting presets. Now, I want to first of all just briefly describe the 3 in the middle because they're very easy to understand. This one with sun means shadows are going to be cast by the Sketchup sun. So wherever the Sketchup sun happens to be located in the sky, shadows are going to be cast on the building, and that's it. All of these lighting presets, by the way, are referring exclusively to natural lighting. So these presets are setting up natural lighting conditions. Artificial lighting is left alone. Exterior with the sun is going to be appropriate for what we're doing. Interior with the sun, same thing. The rendering engine is going to use the SketchUp sun for natural lighting. And then, of course, interior with no sun just means that the SketchUp sun will not be used. It'll be switched off. Now, the 2 on the end are maybe not so obvious. The first one that I want to show you is called studio lighting. Studio lighting, the concept is this. If we were to take a model, a physical model, to a photographer, the photographer would set up our model, set up lighting all around it with filters and gels and all of these really nice things, take a photograph for us, and then provide us with a finished picture. So studio lighting is pretty much what it suggests. It's iRender nXt's emulation of a photographer studio. And when we render the model, this is the result. So there are a couple of things that you'll notice. There are no harsh sun shadows. However, there are very subtle shadows all throughout this model. Now, another example of studio lighting that may describe it a little bit better is a smaller model of a tabletop. This table was also rendered with studio lighting. And you'll notice that there's not just one light shining on this model, there are multiple lights. So you get lots of shadows underneath the table. And more interesting than that is that for this table in particular, studio lighting samples the material in bright, direct light, shown here, in filtered light, shown in lots of different areas across the table, and then also in shadow. Studio lighting is a lighting solution that is showing the sun filtering down onto the model as through a canopy of trees. It's a multiple light source solution. That's why there are lots of shadows underneath this table, not just one harsh sun shadow. I like studio lighting in particular because with the sample of the material in all of these different lighting conditions, I have a really good idea of how this table is going to render no matter how it's set in a larger model. Now we're back to an obvious one. We're going to create a rendering that is going to use the SketchUp sun. And if everyone will excuse me for just a minute, I want to see if my friend Sarah is able to hear. And I'm hopefully she's going to answer yes. Okay. So again, this exterior lighting with sun is a lighting preset. Remember that these lighting presets are only focused on natural lighting. This is going to use the SketchUp sun to render our model. So when this dialog comes up, we click on exterior with sun, and then we just render the model. Behind the model is our rendering of the SketchUp sky. You can see the shadows from the SketchUp sun position, but you'll also notice that every side of our building is pretty nicely illuminated. So even though technically the primary light source against this model is the sun, iRender Next is actually from the SketchUp sky using multiple light sources to illuminate all sides of the model, not just the face where the sun is pointing. You'll also notice that the glass is reflecting very nicely the SketchUp sky. Now this is just a bright blue sky, but because the inside of the building is darker than the outside, the glass, as you would expect, becomes a lot more mirror-like. I'm going to do something that you probably wouldn't do, and I want to show you this to just make a point. So I still have my exterior view of the model. There are no interior lights for this model, so there's no artificial lighting set for this model just yet. And I'm going to select no sun as my option for a preset. And then when I click render, hopefully this is no surprise. There's no sun shining on the model. The sky is also not illuminating the model. And so I kind of get a bright sky, but I get absolutely no illumination on the model whatsoever. Of course, we would not present this rendering to anyone, but I wanted to point out that this rendering is technically correct because there's just no lights shining on our model, and we did that on purpose. Now, the only thing I'm going to do, you'll notice that there are no presets selected at all. The only change that I'm going to make is I'm going to check the sky. In this next example, the sun is not being used, just the sky, and so this is the rendering. Notice that there are still very nice shadows on the model, even underneath the eaves. They're quite a lot more subtle, but they're very, very nice shadows. Now that goes back to the idea that with even just the sky, iRender Next is actually selecting position points in the sky, considering those points to be a source of light against the model, and so as you can see, illuminating the model very nicely, more subtly than using the SketchUp sun, where shadows are actually quite harsh, softening up the model quite a bit and softening up the shadows. It's also kind of nice if you notice that from up under this overhang where it's very dark, not very much light in there, and then notice how the wall continues to brighten as we move down towards the ground and more light hits that surface. Here's another lighting preset that is not necessarily obvious. HDRi means high dynamic range image. These are actually wonderful images that can be used as both the source of natural light for your model, and then at the same time can also be used as a background for the model. Now I selected an HDRi sky that is included with iRender Next, and it's called Sunset. So this is a sunset image that's being used as a background, and it's also being used to illuminate our model. And I picked this one in particular because I'm hoping that the first thing that you noticed is that all of the faces of my building are considerably warmer than they were when I used the bright blue Sketchup sky. The sun, which is down by the horizon, is casting a nice warm glow on my building. We have several HDRi images that can be used as sky backgrounds and also to illuminate your model. Some are more midday and so will cause the rendering of your building to be considerably cooler. The nice thing about sunset or sunrise sky images is that the building renders a lot warmer, and there are many photographers who actually prefer a warmer rendering of buildings when they take their cameras out into the field. I thought it'd be interesting to show you these two side by side. So on the left is the Sketchup sky. It's just a bright blue, perfectly clear sky. Really nice reflections of the sky. Of course, nothing all that interesting because there's no clouds, and a very neutral rendering of my building. Now you compare that to the sunset sky, and we get faces that are quite a lot warmer. You can see it even in the fence. The fence is warmed up quite a bit in terms of color, and we get wonderful wonderful reflections of these soft clouds in the sky as well. And then because the sun is so low, I can also kind of see through this glass a little bit, because I can actually see the line where the wall meets the ceiling. That may not be so obvious on your screens depending on the resolution of your screen. I hope what you've just discovered is that the color of lights in terms of the quality of the rendering is just as important as the brightness of the light, the position of the lighting, and the way that light is thrown against surfaces in the model. To maybe drive that point home a little bit more, here we are again at my rendering using the sunset sky as a backdrop and also as a source of natural light for my project. What I've done is I have clicked sun. So I want to add to my rendering the SketchUp sun. So now I'm going to be using a lighting preset that is the HDRi sky. The HDRi sky is also the background. And now I'm adding to that the sun. And once again, you'll notice that when I do that, all of these are unselected. Now, they're unselected because sun plus sky does not match any of these definitions at all. That's the only reason that it's not selected. But you'll notice that the sky mode is set to HDRi, and you'll notice that we're going to use the sun and sky to illuminate the model. Here's the additional feature that we get when we make this decision. We get sun shadows on the building. I did this because it does add a little bit more detail and depth to the model. What I'd like you to discover from this example is that the lighting presets for natural lighting are a quick way to establish a natural lighting solution. And from there, you may make decisions for your rendering that don't match those lighting preset definitions at all by adding or removing sources of light from the preset definition. In this case, I added the sun. Now, At this point, have I confused anyone, or is this helpful? And you've discovered that the presets are just that, a quick way to establish a lighting solution for your model, and from there you will feel absolutely empowered to change, add to, or remove from the preset definition. Everybody okay with that? Type yes if you are. Wonderful. Thanks, everyone. Interrupt at any time with questions, by the way. And if I'm going too fast, let me know, because your questions are really important. I would be just absolutely delighted to stop and address specific questions. So a pretty nice rendering so far with this sunset background. And now I want to make this rendering a little bit more interesting. So here's what we'll do. This chandelier brings up a dialog called the Render Ready Components. This is a library of lighting fixtures, artificial lighting that we want to add to our model. And then another thing that's kind of interesting is we did add a lot of mirror objects shown in the last tab. So these are just preset mirrors and frames that can be quickly added to a model. The most important part of this dialog in a lot of ways is all of the light fixtures that are available. So I picked one. It's just this classic wall lamp. And on this dialog, what's really interesting is that there are just a few things that have to be established. How bright is the light? This one's set at 75 watts. What color is the light? The default is white. And then lighting channel we're going to cover in detail in a minute, but just so keep in mind that I've selected channel 3 for this light. And I'll explain what that means in a few minutes. You're going to discover this is a very advanced iRender Next feature, but so easy to use and invaluable to you when you're creating renderings of your projects. You know, that's really all there is to it. If you want to place multiple lights, you check multiple, but other than that, you click Create, Place, and we've positioned a light under the porch. This clipboard is another way to get to the long list of render settings. So when you click the clipboard, you get this really nice dialog, and on the left-hand side there are all of these settings that can be used to refine the quality of your rendering. Presets is included here. The other way that we get to that is we just click render, and this comes up by default. I wanted to bring up this dialog because actually for the rendering that I'm going to create next, I want to turn the sun back off. And when I do, now the definition matches HDRi sky once again. The model also renders quite a lot darker because the sun is not being used to illuminate the model. And that's kind of nice. So I have this dusk image of my model, and I have this porch light over the door. Now what's interesting is that I have this nice warm glow from the setting sun warming up my building. And then I have this really bright white light on the porch that's kind of neutralizing that warm glow. This may be exactly the rendering that you're looking for, and so perfect. However, what I'd like to do is click on this light fixture, and when I do this, this pop-up menu appears, and one of the options, you'll notice right down here, iRender Next, Override Light. That brings up this dialog. The only thing that I'm concerned with, we can adjust the brightness of the light, that's fine. We can change the lighting channel, that's okay. What I'm interested in is modifying the color. And I have a cheat sheet that helps me do this. What I decided is that inside this light fixture, there's just an incandescent bulb. Now I can never remember all of these values, so I created a little table for myself that helps me remember them. Might recommend that you do the same thing. If you're not at all comfortable with the colors that you might set, there are heaps of resources on the internet where people way smarter than me will tell you exactly the RGB value for an incandescent bulb. This is the one that I've arrived at. It works very well on my computer setup. And so when I set this light fixture to my incandescent bulb color and then re-render, now I have restored the warmth of my model. And you can decide if for you this looks like an incandescent bulb under this porch or not. Again, just like the sun casting this nice warm glow on my building, which of course the sun does when it's setting, I wanted to warm up the lighting from this fixture on the porch so that it will look more like a real incandescent bulb. Now, I also have added other lights to this model. You'll notice that when we put these two side by side, and again, I'm showing you this because I want you to decide when you're rendering your projects which rendering looks better to you, is going to make a better presentation to your client, and looks more like real artificial lighting. You decide. You're in complete control over the color of the lighting when you position light fixtures from our render-ready components. So take a minute when that dialog is up and set the light color. The default for all of the light fixtures is white. It's a very good place to start. Now what I've done is I've clicked on this light bulb button. And this light bulb brings up this dialog, which is called the Lighting Channels dialog. Lighting Channels is an advanced iRender Next feature that is very useful in a variety of ways, not the least of which is that I already have garden lights added to my model, and additionally I have some recessed lighting underneath that overhang, that front porch. You'll notice that the sun is unchecked. You'll remember that I turned it off. The sky is checked, it's on, and it's dim because this is kind of a sunset image, so I didn't want the sky to be really bright. The garden lights and the recessed lights are off, the porch light is on. When we check garden and recessed, all that happens is those lights get flipped on. So this is an on-off switch. To the right is the brightness of that light. Full on bright is a value of 1. You can actually exceed 1 if you want. You can set a brightness value to 5 if you like. And certainly 0 would be the equivalent of off. Now here's what's important. Even though these lighting channels were turned off when I rendered the model, because the SketchUp layer that these lights are on was turned on, those light fixtures are included in the processing of this rendering. Now I want to just pause for a minute because I want to make sure that everyone understands what I just said. If I turn off the SketchUp layer that these garden lights are placed on, they will not be processed with the rendering. That is distinctly advantageous, especially for a large model. For example, if I'm rendering an office building and I have light fixtures in the ceiling in every single room, I'm sure that you'll understand that the more lights being processed, the longer the rendering will take to complete. So by being a little bit careful with SketchUp layers and grouping lights, perhaps for each room on their own distinct layer, I can turn the light layers off for each room, and so increase the processing speed considerably and take much less time to create a really nice rendering of my project. If that is not clear, please say so now. It's very important. Lighting is a very big part of a ray trace rendering's chore when we're creating a high-end rendering. And so managing lights carefully is going to make a big difference when you're processing a rendering. The difference between what could be a rendering that might take days if you didn't manage the lights properly versus, in this case, this rendering took 5 minutes 55 seconds and is completed in 20 passes. So at 5 minutes, or roughly 6 minutes apiece, I can create a lot of renderings if I'm managing things like lighting properly. Now obviously when I placed those can lights, I anticipated that I wanted them to be incandescent fixtures. And I think this may make a more convincing argument for the value of specifically setting a color for the light to make the rendering look more realistic. If there's anyone who'd rather not go to the internet and try to find this information and you'd just like to have this chart, send me an email, Russell, R-U-S-S-E-L-L, @renderplus.com. I would be happy to send you this chart. It's obviously not complete. I only included lights that I use a lot in renderings. So there are lots of other types of fixtures out there, and maybe we could start a club and everyone can add a different type of bulb, and we'll just keep passing this chart around, share it with everybody. I think this is interesting. This is a closed room, 4 walls, a floor, and a ceiling, no openings in the walls whatsoever, and 1 spotlight shining against this wall. That's it. And what you'll notice is that even though this spotlight is shining against this wall, this back wall is illuminated, as is the floor, as is the ceiling, the brick wall, and in fact the wall over my shoulder is also going to be illuminated. Because the rendering engine is bouncing light off of surfaces. And bounced light will also illuminate other surfaces in the model. Now it's very subtle, but light bouncing off of this wall, which is actually getting here by bouncing off of this wall and off of the ceiling and off of the floor and off of the brick wall and the wall over my shoulder, is actually illuminating the back of this column. Now admittedly it is pretty dark, but it's not black. It is illuminated by bounced lighting. So that's important for you to understand. And the more passes that I allow, here I actually want 100 passes on this model. Now this model is really simple, so right, there's very few surfaces, there's only 1 light, and it took 6 minutes to run 100 passes. So fast, but not a complicated model, so a little bit unfair. You know, just for fun, and I probably should quit banging this drum so hard, but I changed the color of that light to an incandescent bulb just to show you the drastic difference that makes in the quality of the rendering. And again, you decide which you prefer for the presentation you're going to do. And then set the color and make a great rendering for your client. I'm not making an argument for which is better. I'm making an argument that it's very important to consider details, including the actual color of the light. It's quite a different rendering, I think you'll agree, because of one factor, and that's just the color of the light. Now, any surface or any object in a SketchUp model can actually behave as though it is a light. Sort of an interesting idea. So I have that goofy wall hanging back there, and what I did was I right-clicked on it, which gives me this pop-up menu, and you'll notice with iRender Next there's an Edit Materials option, which brings up this dialog. And one of the tabs is called the Glow tab, and what that permits is I can set the glow value of that wall hanging to 40 watts, and then again I'm going to put it on its own separate channel just for fun. So that whole object is now going to behave as though it is basically a light at 40 watts. And this is an omnidirectional fixture. Glow is very interesting because the light that is illuminating the model from this object is the color of the object itself. So if this is a multicolored object, then each different color would be throwing a different colored light onto our model. Pretty interesting. What I like in particular is that even though I have this incandescent bulb, which is warming up the ceiling and warming up the floor, notice how, because this wall fixture is blue, it's cooling the brick right back down. Notice how also, because it's closer to the ceiling above this fixture gets pretty cool compared to what happens from the incandescent bulb. This is a wonderful opportunity when you're illuminating your model with artificial lighting. The amount of control that you have over color based on how you establish light fixtures is very impressive and very important to the quality of your rendering. Everyone is being so quiet, so I'm wondering, is there anything that we've covered that might have sparked a question? And I'm hoping no one is going to be shy. Ask away. Okay, I'm going to back up because I'm getting asked a question about this glow, about the opportunity for glow. So there are two ways to manipulate an object in iRender Next. One is to treat an object as though it's a light fixture. And in the case of it being a light fixture, you are then taking the object, whatever it happens to be, and you are actually declaring that it is a light bulb. Once you do that, you can set a light bulb to be omnidirectional, a spotlight, whatever you want to do, and you can set the color of that light bulb. The benefit of glow is that a glowing object is going to throw much softer light it is omnidirectional, and the light is always going to be in the color that the object was created. So if we had created that wall hanging in green, the light being, it would glow green. And it illuminates the model in a very nice, soft, subtle way. And admittedly, 40 watts isn't much, but because this is on channel 7, if we wanted to, we could go back to the light channels dialog and bump up this light considerably until finally it maybe becomes the brightest artificial light source in the room. Okay, I'm going to back up because I'm getting a question about the lighting channels dialog, so let me scroll to it. Bear with me 1 second. I want to just jump right to that dialog. Remember the lighting channels dialog? This is the one that we use to turn on the garden and the recessed lighting underneath that porch. Well, here's the question is about lock luminance and what does this do? And that's a great question. So thanks for asking, Michael. Michael, this is how this works. When this box is unchecked, iRender Next is going to balance the overall lighting of the model. Sometimes that is quite desirable, especially when a majority of the lighting is interior lighting inside a room and maybe the sun streaming through, and it could be that you have 50 ceiling lights, 25 desk lamp, lots and lots of light going on in this room. And so what iRender Next will do is it will provide an overall balance of that lighting as it calculates the rendering. That's a very nice feature. However, I rely quite a lot on the lighting channels dialog as a post-process opportunity to create multiple renderings from one completed rendering. And this rendering that we're looking at is actually a good example, because you'll notice that I completed this rendering using this sunset sky, and now with the lighting channels dialog, I have the ability to turn off the garden lights, turn on the porch lights, or turn off the porch lights, turn off the recessed lights, and all of the lights are off. And the benefit is I did not have to process a new rendering. So I get a lights off rendering. Now I flip them on. I get a lights on rendering. I get 2 renderings for the price of 1. Now for a model like this one that may not seem significant, this rendering was completed in 200 passes. And at 200 passes, it only took 41 minutes. That's not a big deal. This is a very simple rendering, probably way smaller in size than anything you're rendering in your office. So let's imagine that this rendering took 10 hours. It's more complex, has more lights, a lot more geometry, a lot of things going on. Took 10 hours to process. The odds are very good that if that were the case, I may not be very inclined to create the lights off rendering, because it could be that that's just not important enough to my client presentation to include it. However, when I'm able to, in this iRender Next render window, with the use of lighting channels, and remember those are available by clicking on the light bulb icon, if I'm able to very quickly flip off some lights, adjust some brightness values of lights to create an additional rendering for my presentation in a matter of minutes, not hours, I actually might have a lot of fun embellishing my presentation with some variations on my image. The post-processing features of iRender Next can be very important in helping you fine-tune the renderings that are generated, create entirely new renderings from a finished rendering that might have took hours to complete, and so add some nice value to the presentation, and hopefully as a designer you'll have a lot of fun with that. I will generally then, Michael, I'll generally have lock luminance checked. And so what that means is that if I turn off, lower, or brighten these garden lights, iRender Next doesn't try to rebalance the lighting for the whole model. That's the important thing to understand. If this is unchecked, when I turn off those garden lights, then iRender Next is going to rebalance the lighting, and sometimes you'll get some results that you didn't really anticipate because you're giving control of lighting balance to iRender Next, and it does a great job. But when I'm balancing the lighting on my renderings, I actually want to balance the lighting on my own, so I check lock luminance. Michael, did I help you or confuse you more? Michael says he understands. I hope everyone else does as well. Are there any other questions about lighting with iRender Next? I have a question about color that I want to answer, and this is, I'm sorry, I have to move the menu so I can see who's asking this question. This is Joe. Okay, Joe. Joe's asking a question about setting lighting colors, and I want to answer your question in this way. When you set lighting colors, first of all, this is a pretty standard Windows color selector dialog. And so there are any number of ways to set the colors, as you're aware. What we think probably is the most overlooked feature of this menu is setting the brightness of the color using this slider bar. So this is taking the actual hue of the color and making it darker at the bottom, brighter at the top. And a lot of people tend, I think, maybe to miss this adjustment. And you are right. Because we're using this standard Windows dialog, Joe, it doesn't include the hex values of the colors. I like to define colors using hex values because I use Photoshop a lot. Maybe others of you are fans of using hex values as well. So I'll put that on can we consider this list and see what the programmers think about maybe including hex values as well. It's a great suggestion, Joe, and right now I would just say that in general the slider bar kind of addresses the same thing in terms of being able to not change the hue but just modify the brightness of the color. We have time for quite a few more questions if you have them. I want to mention again that at the conclusion, I will publish a recording of this webinar on YouTube, and then each of you will receive an email from me that will point you to the link where the video resides. It might be that if you have other people in your office who are either curious about iRender Next or are maybe even also learning to use it, pointing them to the video and letting them review the information that you've just covered, and maybe sitting beside them and explaining in more detail your experience with iRender Next would be helpful to them as well. Okay. Now, I'll ask you a question. In terms of your experience with iRender Next and your understanding of lighting, is there a question about lighting with iRender Next that you've had in your mind that did not get addressed at all this afternoon? Because this would be a good time for us to address your specific question. Somebody type anything. Okay. Well, I hope this has been, I hope that, thank you, Sarah. Very nice of you to say so. Thanks very much, Joe. I'm glad you enjoyed it. Michael, thanks again. I appreciate everyone being here. Diane, thanks very much. And I'm sorry there are so many of you here that I'm going to fail to mention everyone. But I appreciate everyone joining us this afternoon for this webinar. I try to keep these brief because I know everybody's busy. You have real jobs and you have work to do, and you probably are like me. You have a lot of renderings to get after. So please check back on our website. We update our live webinar schedule frequently. There'll be a whole new July schedule that I'll be publishing pretty soon. I have a webinar scheduled for next week that's about iRender Next and reflections. That one will be very interesting. And I believe next week also there's an introduction to iRender Next. So if there's anyone else in your office who's curious about iRender Next and how to use it, whether or not they are specifically using the software, if you'd like them to get more familiar, sign them up for the webinar, have them attend. They're as welcome as everyone and always happy to answer their questions. So thanks again, everybody. I really appreciate everyone being here, and I hope that you'll join us again for an upcoming webinar. Let's go get some renderings completed.